Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to everyone for being here with us today. For those who don't know me, my name is Avery Slater. I'm assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Toronto and faculty fellow at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. Before we begin today with our talk, Valuing Social Data by Professor Salomé Viljoen, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. These and other Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island developed complex and effective governance systems based on respect for all life and the intelligence of the natural world. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people working to reclaim their rights to self-determination. We're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. Although we're all joining probably from different places, we invite you to reflect on the history and the relations of the land that you're currently located on. A few logistics as we start. The session today is being recorded. This talk will last for about 50 minutes, and after the talk, we will take questions from the audience. We invite everyone to participate. And during the Q&A portion of the seminar, we encourage participants to use the raise hand function in the Zoom meeting controls to ask a question. You can also put a short version of your question in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Professor Salomé Viljoen. Salomé Viljoen is an assistant professor of law at Michigan Law School, where she teaches and writes about contracts, privacy, commercial surveillance, and data governance. Salomé works on the law and political economy of data and artificial intelligence to explore the role of law in structuring digital life and the effect of the digital political economy on law. She's especially interested in platform power, how information law structures inequality, and how law theorizes data about people, so social data. Some of her recent and forthcoming work develops a theory of affirmative socially beneficial uses of social data and examines the role of public agencies in gathering, governing, and using social data as a form of public governance. Other recent and forthcoming work considers under what kinds of conditions the datafication of social life is morally or legally wrongful. Broadly, she's interested in what legal status social data enjoys, what kinds of legal interests social data production and use implicates, and how the law does and should regulate the digital economy. Professor Viljoen's academic work has appeared or is forthcoming in places like the Yale Law Journal, the Columbia Law Review, Big Data and Society, and the ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. She also writes essays and articles for places like Nature, The Guardian, Logic Magazine, and Phenomenal World. So very pleased to have you here today, Professor Viljoen. Without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Avery, for that warm welcome and wonderful introduction. I'm actually going to try to keep my talk a little bit on the shorter side because which is a sort of the tradition in law, we like to keep our talk short so that we can focus on conversation. So hopefully I'll come in a bit under 50 minutes so that we can sort of open things up. Okay, so the talk that I'm going to be presenting to you all today is based on a paper of the same title, Valuing Social Data, that's co-authored with Amanda Parsons, who is a tax law scholar at UC Boulder. And it's forthcoming from Columbia Law Review next year. And Amanda and I like to joke this paper is what happens when a tax scholar and a data privacy scholar get to talking and spend too much time chatting in one another's offices about how law constitutes data as an input to the digital economy instead of, toiling away alone on our solo authored work. So this is an endeavor of friendship as much as it is scholarship. So to sort of begin, we're generating a lot of data these days. So since the advent of computers to 2018, the sum total of data produced was about 127 trillion gigabytes. And we are expected to produce more than that in just 1 year, just in 2024. And, you know, to put where all of this data is coming from in a bit of perspective, so much of our life is being sort of datafied in sort of passive ways by a variety of sensors all around us. So it's not just the websites we visit and the phone that we spend a lot of time on and that tracks us as we move around and live our lives, but also from things like also like from things like cars. So cars, most modern cars are equipped with a variety of sensors, and the contemporary car generates up to 25 gigabytes of data per hour. So we're datafying a lot of features of our lives these days. And all of this data makes companies a lot of money. So data-intensive business is really kind of a key strategy for some of the largest and wealthiest companies today. So here on this list, you see Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, all companies that we kind of know are very data intensive. One wouldn't necessarily think it, but Visa and United Health that are both on this list are also companies that are generating and collecting tons of data. United Health, for example, is a health insurance company here in the United States. They have been very actively acquiring data analytics companies in the sort of health space and really integrating that throughout their products. So really kind of pursuing a very data intensive strategy. And a recent company here on this list, NVIDIA, is of course an AI company. AI models are trained on gobs and gobs of data. NVIDIA does the chips to manufacture it, but they're certainly part of the pipeline that we're interested in here. So as a person who kind of comes from the data privacy, data governance side of things, I'm really sort of used to thinking about commercial surveillance and the digital economy in terms of the social problems that arise from the datafication of social life. But here in this piece, Amanda and I were really interested in an exercise of conceptual political economy. So really kind of taking a step back and asking, like, what is happening here? What's driving all of this activity? And why is law, or at least the areas of law that we know, tax and data governance, so bad at kind of apprehending and regulating this business activity? And Amanda and I, over the course of our conversations when we were fellows together, we're really just struck by this persistent sense that law was quite poorly equipped to meet and manage this mode of production in the digital economy that is kind of datafied human inputs. By which I just mean all of the strategies, tactics, investment bets, business plans that companies use to turn data about people into wealth and power, and all the ways that pursuit of wealth along this particular dimension might create distortive economic and social effects, right? So patterns of excessive concentration, accrual of concerning quantities of power, and that this is activity that is or ought to be of great legal and regulatory relevance, but also has the potential, subject to sort of different legal and regulatory structures, to perhaps achieve socially better outcomes. So the piece really provides a conceptual approach to explain or account for why this disjuncture might exist between law and the digital economy, which again, we think really matters both for its missed opportunities in terms of stemming harm, as well as fostering benefits. So to do all of that, the article really focuses on a particular source of value, social data, that we sort of focus on, and the novel subspecies of use value that it provides, which we call prediction value, and kind of charts why this novel store and type of value is at odds with the laws presumably tasked with regulating how this value is created, accumulated, and used. So some definitions are in order. First up, social data. So we use the term social data to refer jointly to kind of two interrelated categories of data. So first, data that collects traces of human activity directly, right? So information produced from the interaction between people living their lives and the digital devices, the sensors, the phones that apprehend and store traces of them doing so. The second is data that is used to apprehend, infer, or predict human activity, but that might not directly be human data. So for example, weather data can be used to predict traffic patterns, but we wouldn't normally think of weather data as like data collected from people. It isn't collected from people. So in contrast with the sort of more commonplace term, personal data, social data really expresses our view, perhaps shared by many here, that data is useful, i.e. socially and economically valuable, not for what it can tell a company about me, but for how data about me, when combined with lots of other data about other people, can reveal things about groups of people. Prediction value is our other kind of key term here, and it refers to the specific use value that results from the cultivation and accumulation of social data. So part one of our piece is really a meditation on value and an exhortation to hold the concept of value apart from how we normally think of economic and all too often social value, which is to equate it kind of at a conceptual level with exchange value. Which is typically measured as a thing's clearing price on some imagined or real market. So we're just kind of trying to hold the concept of value apart from how we normally think of value in economic terms, which is prices. So social data assets are used by entities to provide insight into human behavior, guide predictions about behavior, and optimize strategies to intervene in and modify behavior. In other words, the value of social data lies in its serving as a material store of the capacity to apprehend and predict human behavior. Data therefore provides the potential or the capacity to exert some measure of control over future behavior on the basis of its materialized insight. So in the piece, we again argue that it's really helpful to think of prediction value as a kind of use value that's distinct from or can be kind of held apart and isn't always neatly transformed into exchange value. And again, exchange value is that priced or monetary value. So this is all kind of abstract. And so I'm just going to kind of ground it all in an example of what I mean. So we have a data subject here, Anna, and Anna is 16 weeks pregnant. Anna uses Apricot, a popular fertility tracking app and social media site, where she can upload information on her ovulation cycle, eating habits, exercise patterns, sleep, mood changes, a range of other physical symptoms. Now, Apricot aggregates and synthesizes all of this data that users like Anna share, not to sell people's data directly, which they reassure their users they would never do, but to sell insights about their user base to clients like advertisers, employment consultancies, consumer credit agencies, and others. And this is how Apricot makes money. These clients, in turn, combine Apricot data, or the insights they get from Apricot, with data from other sources on users' TV viewing habits, their purchasing patterns, their movement patterns. And Becca, who does not use Apricot, fits the behavioral patterns that emerge from the analysis of Apricot users. So like Anna and all the other Apricot users, she exhibits the same patterns of changed TV viewing and online purchasing behavior that indicates that she too is or is likely to be pregnant. So in a basic sense, because of how and why digital companies like Apricot collect and use data, data about Anna and all the other Anna's pregnancy is also data about Becca's pregnancy. And this is what we mean by the idea of social data. Now, pregnancy is a good example to use because early pregnancy data is really valuable. So having a child is like a big event in a consumer's life. It's when Anna is about to sort of drastically change her consumptive habits, really change up the ways that she's buying things, where she's buying things. So this is a really lucrative time to kind of get to her, to nudge her into a desired set of purchasing behaviors, but also in a more general matter, just like a really lucrative time to study her consumptive habits to understand how consumers change and what they change into generally when undergoing this kind of moment of profound social rupture. And so that value, that data that infers or predicts pregnancy status, that is its prediction value. Now, of course, a lot of how the digital economy works is by turning this prediction value into money, i.e. somewhere, somehow, by means of that company's particular business model, transforming that prediction value into priced exchange value. But we want to kind of pause here and note that it's really important conceptually to understand that predictive value isn't just fully like one-to-one converted or transformed into exchange value, or not only that. It's in a sense more general. It confers power over Anna or Becca that can be used to enact forms of allocation, social discipline, moral judgment that are quite apart from any kind of commodified market value that sort of materialized bit of control represents. So I'm from the state of Nebraska originally, that's where I grew up. And currently in the state of Nebraska, abortion is illegal after 12 weeks. So if Becca miscarried in a suspicious manner next week, and that information was used to pursue enforcement action against her, she could face legal charges and imprisonment. And this would be a use of prediction value, which serves to enforce her subordinated social and political position in virtue of being a woman or a pregnant person, and it exposes her to discipline and judgment. And that's all happening in like a non-commodified way, right? Like that's not like, there's not like a priced value to what's being done here, right? That's an exercise of that prediction value that's non-commoditized. It's not being expressed as exchange value. I always want to kind of note here that this is like a bad example of the like general or kind of pre-market exercise of prediction value, but you could also imagine kind of like a good counterpoint. So the same prediction value that predicts that Becca is likely pregnant could be used to enact social services and forms of social recognition that don't discipline and subordinate Becca, but that uplift and empower her. So if knowledge of Becca's pregnancy prompts health services in her area to send her free prenatal vitamins, to connect her to local prenatal services and community programs, to kind of help local hospital services plan for who's having babies when, allocate staff and resources accordingly, even perhaps kind of make medium to long-term planning in her area for childcare, how many children are about to enter like and need like childcare services, let's plan that accordingly. All of that would be an exercise of that prediction value that would serve to alleviate and kind of socialize the political and social and material costs of biological production, so that it's not just Becca's burden to carry alone, but is kind of collectively managed. So again, social data about people can be inferred or directly collected. Prediction value is just a kind of use value, how entities use social data and the control it confers through apprehending facts about me to manage, predict, nudge, game, discipline, and generally kind of dialectically constitute me in ways that might be aligned with my own ends or might not be. Okay, so in the paper, we really kind of advanced two claims about social data and its prediction value. Claim number one, right, is that this particular form of use value, prediction value, is a paradigmatic value form of the contemporary informationalized economy, and that its transformation into exchange value, so how companies go about collecting it and then using it to make money, is complicated, imperfect, not straightforward, and messy. And that this messy gap between the cultivation and accumulation of prediction value and its sort of moment of being expressed as exchange value really matters for understanding this economic activity. The second claim is that social data and prediction values' role in the wealth accumulation strategies of the digital economy really kind of confound the traditional way that law handles and thinks of regulation of both data about people and more generally the like cultivation and accumulation of value. So focusing on claim one, the article kind of details how prediction value is cultivated and divides this activity into 3 scripts for producing value, and in turn, how that use value is or isn't translated into exchange value. So the first script is direct conversion. So this would include activities like selling data directly, so to data brokers. Data brokerage is a huge industry, and that's just sort of directly converting the prediction value of data into exchange value. We're just directly buying and selling access to data or data directly. You can also, in this first script, put activity that sells access to the data value. So in my Apricot example, Apricot wasn't directly selling user data. It was sort of sitting on that asset and then selling insights that it sort of derived, like derivative value from sitting on that asset to its clients. And the sort of predominant model here is targeted advertising, right? So Facebook doesn't sell data. They sit on that asset's value, and then they sell kind of like, or sort of use the premium of sitting on that value to sell to advertisers. The second script is kind of indirect conversion of prediction value into an exchange value. So this sort of is meant to capture how entities can use data to develop new products and services more quickly at a lower cost. So for example, Square, which is a payment platform, right, that sort of is where you tap your phone and that a company will use to kind of product service payments between itself and consumers. They have gotten into the business of providing commercial loans. And so the way that Square uses my data, right, isn't to target me with ads, but to leverage their position between buyers and sellers, and their sort of ability to accumulate really valuable longitudinal full transactions data to really understand the landscape of consumer purchasing in which a business operates, and to offer businesses loans that are sort of deeply informed by the understanding of that business and its customers that it has because of all of the sort of longitudinal transactional data that it's privy to. So the pitch here is something like Square doesn't need to sort of price in as much risk into its commercial lending because of the access to really rich information that it has. And this means that it can offer more attractive or more competitive rates for businesses in its commercial lending activity. But script 2 also, and importantly, uses social data value to lower cost by squeezing surplus from workers and increasing revenue by squeezing surplus from consumers. So on the lowering cost side of things, algorithmic management of surveilled workers is associated with lower wages and increased returns to platforms. So there's been sort of wonderful detailed empirical work by people like Aaron Shapiro, Vina Duval, and others really kind of showing this trend. On the consumer side, something like first-degree price discrimination, so maybe not perfect first-degree price discrimination, but something approaching it, is associated also, of course, with higher surplus captured by the platforms. And this has been something that Joe Stiglitz and some of his recent work on the digital economy really emphasizes. So finally, script 3 is the sort of indefinitely delayed or potential non-conversion of prediction value into exchange value. So again, this point or this like script is meant to kind of capture the idea that social data value, of course, is not just an accrual of wealth, it's an accrual of power, and that is kind of its basic form of value. For the tax scholar of the two of us, Amanda, this is kind of the slipperiest concept for her. But I think for me as a data governance scholar, this is like quite core to my understandings of what data does. And I think it represents the direction that informational capitalist modes of production are going. But this is meant to get at that idea that I sort of highlighted earlier with the pregnancy example, which is that prediction value need not be converted into exchange value to be valuable in the social and economic sense. It can be used to discipline me. It can make me, kind of socially subordinated. It can socially empower me in ways that kind of prefigure the potential uses of that prediction value to make me like a more efficient risk bet or a more lucrative consumer. So the second claim that we really kind of feature in the piece is that social data and prediction values' role in the wealth accumulation strategies of the digital economy really confound the traditional way that law handles and thinks of the regulation of both data about people and the cultivation and accumulation of value. And here we really use our own fields to detail two ways that we see this disconnect happening. The first kind of problem is legal regimes that have historically been tasked with governing value creation. And these areas of law are now struggling to apply their kind of existing mechanisms and regimes to prediction value. And we really focus here on tax law. So tax law, traditionally in the business of regulating value, right? That's our entire legal regime that thinks about how we sort of index forms of value creation happening in the economy, engage in redistribution of relative gains. And we sort of highlight in the piece the struggle of, for example, international tax law to grant taxing authority of the wealth of the digital economy. Really kind of struggling to come up with frameworks for how to allocate taxing authority between countries to tax where value is being created. So because tax sort of traditionally focuses on the moments when prediction value meets the market, right, and converts into exchange value, it's really hard to capture and assign taxing authority to the moments where prediction value is being cultivated and accumulated. Because again, that gap exists and it describes a lot of value accumulation happening in the digital economy. The second kind of context is legal regimes that are regulating data protection, but haven't really understood themselves historically to have the primary aim of those legal regimes to be governing value creation. But again, now functionally are doing so because they're regulating data protection. And this is where we really kind of focus on my area of law, privacy and data protection law. So again, I think privacy and data protection law really struggles with and is inadequate at governing the massive back-end systemic process of value creation that is happening in the digital economy, because the way that we typically kind of conceive of regulating data protection is through the assignment of individual privacy or data protection rights, which are really primarily meant to protect one set of legal interests in social data, like my privacy interest, but that doesn't capture and couldn't possibly kind of give force to all of the social and political economic effects of mass at scale value production at the scale of the digital economy. It's just kind of a bad fit. So it's a bit like thinking trespass law and property is a completely sufficient legal regime to govern the secondary financial market for mortgage-backed securities. Trespass is like one kind of harm I can experience with respect to my property, but it's completely inadequate to be policing all of the social and political economic effects of value production on the basis of, for example, a property asset. So that's just kind of like a rough analogy to get a sense of our claims about data protection here. So just want to kind of close with thinking about what this approach gets us, or why we think it's a valuable way of thinking about social data value. The first is really conceptual. So turning to old concepts of use value and exchange value can be helpful to get a handle on these disconnects that vex the digital economy. So a lot of things, again, are happening prior to the moment that informationalized input meet the market and get priced, if they ever do. And much of what's happening, we think, is quite significant and of legal relevance. So the second is doctrinal. So to focus on my area, again, taking seriously the challenge of governing prediction value means moving beyond privacy to more robust institutional forms of data governance. So again, we don't typically think that my permission alone is sufficient to account for systemic effects that can rise from economic activity, the accumulation of excessive market power, forms of social control that can't just be used against me, but also against others. And particularly kind of ways that social control can be distilled and used against people that might occupy a more vulnerable social position than myself, even if I've given permission, right? So a focus on data governance rather than just on privacy doesn't just freeze data law in a defensive posture with respect to all of this production, as if the best the law can offer in light of the digital economy is just this kind of like limited individual damage control. But really done right, our law can and should kind of think about how it's governing a system of value production, right? To sort of foster socially beneficial cultivation and use of prediction value, disincentivize and punish and kind of diminish socially harmful cultivations and uses of prediction value. So again, governing not just data, but thinking through how to facilitate and allocate the governing capacity of data infrastructures to sort of more socially beneficial ends. I'm not the tax scholar here, but to hint at a potential tax takeaway, the kind of resistance of predictive value to post hoc redistribution also kind of suggests that when it comes to the forms of wealth that are produced by the digital economy, we might favorably look at forms of pre-distribution rather than redistribution. So if it's true that prediction value is kind of hard to just easily, fungibly like redistribute and do tax and transfer on, then forms of value being produced by the digital economy might be better managed with pre-distributional forms rather than redistributional forms. So rather than doing the kind of market two-step of letting market efficiency grow the pie and then worry about the redistribution of relative gains at step 2 in the tax system, if that's kind of just conceptually or fundamentally very hard to do with the forms of value being produced here, we might want to rethink the wide latitude that we give those forms of regulatory sort of design. Another sort of tax takeaway, if there are like tax nerds in the audience, is that it kind of lends increasing strength to one side of the debate in tax right now, which is like, do we tax wealth or do we tax income? Prediction value is really a form of wealth, right? That's sort of like pre-meeting the market value. And so if, as we argue, a great deal of the value being produced in the digital economy sits for a prolonged period of time in that wealth category, then we kind of might lend strength to all of the kind of positions or arguments for taxing wealth as opposed to taxing income. So that's an existing prior debate in tax law, but we might kind of think that there's extra reasons to go with one side of that debate as opposed to the other, given the direction that the digital economy is moving. And then finally, kind of a normative upshot here. This is really kind of beyond the scope of what we focus on in this paper, but it's of keen interest for me in my more normative theoretical work, which is that disambiguating claims of what makes the datafication of social life wrongful is kind of one benefit of holding prediction value and exchange value apart. So is it that, or is it potentially wrongful that prediction value is being cultivated at all? Or is it that the ways in which the political economy of prediction values cultivation, the kind that is being produced by who for what reasons, being dictated by its imperfect processes of transformation into exchange value is what makes it wrong? And there are kind of different articulations of that, different accounts of what makes the datafication of social life wrongful. But I think, again, having a language of like prediction value versus exchange value helps at least crystallize for me which accounts are kind of fundamentally taking issue with the commodification aspect of this process, as opposed to the like apprehension or legibility process aspect of this process. And that I think can be really clarifying for kind of plumbing normative intuitions that we might have. And again, for me as a legal scholar, kind of operationalizing those distinct normative kind of accounts into different legal responses. So I will stop there. I think well, I didn't get it totally under 50 minutes, but hopefully still plenty of time for discussion, and looking forward to discussing with you all. Thanks.
Hey, wow, thank you so much for that really, really fascinating talk, Salomé. And I think we'll have a number of responses from the audience. I have a question, but I see we have, trying to figure out who's that hand from there. Okay, right. Okay, so let's start off with a question from Jamie Duncan.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation, Dr. Viljoen. So this really reminded me of an experience that I had with a reviewer, where I tried to sort of advance a conceptualization of data as a product in a way that's sort of really complementary to this. And they were a privacy scholar that kind of balked at this notion of conceptualizing social data as a product. And they basically said, sort of within the sort of scope of your normative claim at the end, that it's too easy to sort of excuse or deepen data markets when we're thinking about data this way. And then they also suggested sort of like taking on a more rights and interests based approach. So I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about how understanding data as a product can come up against sort of notions of privacy as a quasi right. And then sort of the follow-on question is to that is sort of how does sort of the privacy paradigm of data rights complicate the sort of de facto claims to ownership that currently exist over prediction value and exchange value, just in the sense that, like, if Meta sort of claims ownership over data that's about me and I have the right to sort of access it or force them to move it, how does that sort of change how we're thinking about these kinds of values as property?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to kind of start with the second one first. There has been kind of this like long zombie debate where people will, companies will just sort of like de facto assert property interests in information, in data, and then like privacy scholars will pop up and be like, privacy is not a property interest. And that's true. And like, we've all debunked it. Like, I've written my piece and many others have written many other pieces before me, and they will write them after me because shockingly, not every CEO in the world has like read my phenomenal world piece on this and been completely convinced and like decided they're never going to have this intuition. So I want to just note that like, that's all by way of saying that, the privacy versus ownership conversation, I think, is just touching on like really deep intuitions and really like justified legal and sort of normative views that people have with respect to information that are kind of intractable. And the way that I at least think of them is that these sort of ownership interests or ownership claims, they're usually legally indexed more as like contractual rights and trade secrecy claims, but they de facto kind of work to propertize information. They're really there to express the like commercial interests in information. So again, the way that data about people makes money for companies. Whereas privacy is really kind of like a separate this is just my view, but I think it's shared by a lot of people. Privacy is really indexing non-commercial interests that I have with respect to that information. So I think of that as kind of like an anti-expressive non-commercial interest that I have. And the privacy interests might work to kind of like constrain how you can exploit a data asset, the same way that we might think that like human rights constrain how much you can like exploit worker labor, right? So there are just like different kinds of legal interests. The non-commercial interests that human laborers have by virtue of being human limit or constrain the types of ways that you can like exploit commercial interests from people. That's like a much more visceral, more powerful version of what we have with information. That's how I kind of conceive of those tensions. That being said, people don't oftentimes think of them as interacting in that way. They think it's like one or the other, and people have fights over like which one ought to like wholly contain the other. And that kind of feeds into your second question, which is that, I think I'm sympathetic. I mean, I am a privacy scholar, so I'm sympathetic to the argument that like data about people is not property. It's not a commodity. It's like normatively wrongful to even concede that it is. And that's really what the like rights and interest framework gets us. But I think it's one can step back from like a normative question of whether or not it's bad or good to descriptively look at what is in fact happening in the digital economy and to say like, we might diagnose this as normatively wrongful. Nevertheless, like cue my first chart, all of that data being collected. If we care about digital surveillance, we care about what those rights or interests are meant to be protecting, we have to understand the political economic forces driving commercial surveillance. And for that, you have to kind of suspend a normative account to just descriptively look at what is in fact happening in the digital economy. And for that, I think you do have to look at how data about people is turning into money for companies. And one can then separately, as I sort of point to, think through, like, is it the commodification problem aspect that's a problem? Is it like the mere fact that like information about my pregnancy exists? Like, is that the problem? Those are different normative accounts. But getting clear on that sort of cashes out as like very distinct legal agendas. But we can stick our hands in the sand and talk about privacy rights and privacy interests all we want. But the fact is that like the grinding machine of capital is going to continue to grind, and it's going to continue to datafy every aspect of human life as long as that is like a valuable business proposition. So anyway, I'm sorry that reviewer pushed back on that, but like I think it captures a really deep problem with thinking that privacy is the only kind of thing that we need to regulate all of this activity. It's just wholly inadequate to sort of handling the political economy. It's just the scale of the political economic incentives here. Sorry, that was long. Try to get more questions. I won't take so long on each one.
That was wonderful. So we have a question from Professor Luke Stark.
Hi.
Hi, Salomé. It's great to see you. Great to be here. If I'm a little muddled, it's because I'm getting over COVID. My brain is not quite back to normal. So I had a question about prediction value. I should say I entirely agree with this framework. I think it's really great. Does the veracity of the prediction have anything to do with prediction value? Right. There's one of the things that I've been really interested in lately is it's inference, and the way that inferences can be made about people and useful in commercial context without them having any actual basis in reality. Right. Yeah. So maybe not. I'm suspecting the answer is not, that it doesn't matter if prediction is useful, but in that case, or rather is true. It could just be useful. But in that case, I'm wondering if there's some way to use the distinction you made at the end of the talk around the kind of truth claims of prediction to distinguish between when prediction value is when a prediction is just out of bounds versus when it should be regulated in particular ways.
Yeah, it's a great point. So it's completely, it's always funny when I'm sure you come across this problem all the time. You're like drawing from a bunch of literatures, you're like speaking to a bunch of literatures, and all of them have their like particular insight. So I had presenting an early version of this piece, just a fascinating exchange with a person who was studying basically how like targeted advertising is like snake oil and like stupid and pointless and like not better. And it kind of gets to your point, right? Like a ton of prediction value is like companies are like speculatively accumulating a bunch of prediction value and then turning it into like hard market capitalizations. And it's like unclear how good the prediction actually is. So, and to your point, our kind of like position as legal scholars is that you can have a bunch of like mispriced assets that are like, for example, like priced as really valuable, but like actually junk that like also get that truth claim wrong. So again, to use the example of the like 2008 financial crisis, right? We had like a bunch of like AAA rated financial mortgage products that were like priced as like really high quality that were actually just like, in terms of like the truth claim, like garbage. And that's like speculative value as opposed to like real value. So you can have like speculative prediction value. In fact, we suspect that a lot of prediction value is probably speculative prediction value, but that speculative value can still be enormously legally and socially disruptive in its cultivation. So we actually, not to be Pollyannish about it, but we actually think that like getting a better legal handle on prediction value is like a necessary first step to say like, okay, now let's engage in some discipline. Like, is this actually valuable prediction value, or is it speculative bubble garbage prediction value? And like, being able to sort of think about how we might assess that or like discipline that kind of behavior a little bit better than we currently do. But before we can really do that as like a legal regime or like a tax regime or like, you know, we kind of need to have a name for that concept to begin with. And right now, you know, tax and antitrust and a number of other kind of economic regulatory regimes don't look at all like for them, like until there's a price, there's no value. So like all of that speculative activity just like isn't apprehended or indexed by laws regulating value production until it turns into money. And a lot of those money claims are kind of not the best at disciplining the puffery and the speculative prediction value as opposed to the truth claims. I do think you're totally right that it implicates our normative assessments. But you know, I mean, I think that people could have a problem with like truthful prediction value claims on separate grounds from untruthful prediction value. I think which you would completely agree. Yeah, I think again that they like index the commodification versus the like legibility or apprehension critiques separately. But yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. We have a hand from Maricia Levesque. Maricia. Oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
I'm still muted. Great. Hi, and thanks for this really interesting talk. So full disclosure, I have only very barely skimmed the paper, so perhaps the answer is in there. But I was curious about your third script, converting predictions into political power, especially as it pertains to state or just generally public actor use of data. I didn't fully grasp how that mapped onto the tax debate, if at all, in the sense that even reforming tax law doesn't really map the issue when we're talking about states using predictions to enforce abortion bans, for instance, or even risk assessment tools in the criminal justice system, kind of subduing people into compliance. So even if we think about tax regimes, and I understand this question is a bit unfair as this is perhaps more of your co-authors area, but even if we think about sort of wealth redistribution instead of income redistribution or even pre-distribution, I'm trying to think through what would be sort of the public equivalent to that to address this script that you so eloquently elaborate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And it comes from, I think, in part, you know, we use the state example, the abortion example, because I think because it's helpful for people to grasp the like pre-commodified form of power that's being cultivated. But it's not so good at helping us make the point that companies are not just market actors. They also geopolitically are political actors. So they also engage in this kind of activity. So Uber, for example, had Project Greyball, where they basically like anticipated who they thought were likely to be civil servants in cities where they were operating illegally to sort of gray out Uber service around civil servants until they had gotten like wide adoption of their service, at which point it would be like politically expensive and difficult for those people to kick them back out of the city. That's kind of a form of using prediction value that, I mean, in the longer term sense is in favor of them gaining market position, but in that particular use is kind of like a political use of that prediction value. And in a larger sense, you know, when companies grow very large and powerful, as large digital platforms have, they have geopolitical interests. And they can use prediction value to kind of exercise those geopolitical interests. So there's been like a lot of, you know, examples of this across different countries. When I presented this a few weeks ago, somebody was telling me about in India how they were trying to pass really sort of like a particular interpretation of India's data protection law. Again, I apologize for people who are experts in Indian law. I'm not, I'm telling the story secondhand, but basically how Meta kind of marshaled WhatsApp and kind of activated a bunch of people who use WhatsApp to sort of say like, this is going to sort of like ruin your experience or all of this, and sort of like activated a bunch of its users to sort of really marshal against that form of technology regulation. So where that kind of meets the tax debate is a great question. I would love to hear Amanda's answer to it. I'm going to try to provide my own. So where I think that meets the tax debate is that one kind of reason or justification that people who are in favor of granting taxing authority on the basis of where wealth is being created, as opposed to where income is being realized, is not just for the obvious material reason of like getting money from a company that's operating in its area, but also to have like a lever to sort of constrain and discipline the way in which these companies are operating in these jurisdictions. And so sort of like just like another regulatory hook that they have. And that really is like a theory of power constraint, right? So if Meta is just running rampant over India, one potential authority that the Indian government might have is taxing authority. But if we don't recognize the prediction value that's being produced in India, that means that the Indian state is kind of fighting Meta with one arm tied behind their back. And that's like a story of like geopolitical power alignment, I think is what Amanda would say. But again, not the tax scholar on the piece. So that's just my best guess.
Great, thank you. So I see some questions coming in on the chat. If you want to ask the question directly, if you could use the raise hand function, I'll wait. Oh, okay, great. I have a question, but I'm going to go first to Hayani, and then I can ask a question. Go ahead, Hayani.
All right. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. So if I understood correctly, I'm very curious to hear more about the tax point, and I think you were touching on that again just now. So if I understood correctly, it would be shifting from looking at a company, looking at the value that a company crystallizes, and then looking instead at the potential value that a company can crystallize because of its social data, if that's correct. And then assuming that's correct, I mean, if it's not, then please, I guess let me know where I misunderstood. But assuming that's correct, then how do you? Because I just worry that that's a big Pandora's box of like once you open the door into looking at probabilities or at the expected value of something in this particular moment that may or may not crystallize it in that way, how do you address that? And second, I think as a related question to your point about constraining private power, if that's the main policy goal, then why not use antitrust laws rather than tax laws? And I understand that tax laws would be, I guess, an interesting way to do this because of the income distribution argument. But like, I guess I have questions about whether the cost of opening a Pandora's box of taxing based on probabilities wouldn't be too big of a cost. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. So I'm going to again kind of try to channel Amanda. So it's on the one hand, it's not just taxing the sort of probability of the realization of value. It's taxing a form of wealth creation that's happening that has not yet cleared a market. So one could think of something like issuing options to your employees. There's a probability of what that option value is, right? But we're pretty good at like pricing this difference between the like expected value and the realized value of something like an option. Now, we're very far from doing anything like that with prediction value. We recognize that. But there are people who internally do assess kind of like the importance of something like the digital infrastructures of something to the centrality of a business strategy. So one could think about like starting to sort of come to grips with some way of quantifying prediction value in order to sort of think about what the taxing bill of that is. But I think for Amanda, as an international tax law scholar, the important point is that if you don't do something like tax at the point that the employee is being granted options, but wait until the IPO happens and the employee then like sells the option, right? That geopolitically speaking, where the sale is happening is like the United States and Ireland. But where a lot of prediction value is happening is, for example, in India, where there are 500 million WhatsApp users. India cannot tax Meta for the 500 million WhatsApp users that are using their product and generating immense amounts of prediction value every day. I'm from South Africa originally. South Africa has like no taxing authority on all of the people who are using WhatsApp in that country, on Meta. So there's like a geopolitical like access to being able to tax and transfer the wealth that's being produced that you don't get if you wait for the moment of the market, that value meeting the market and converting into something like an investor market evaluation, which is happening in US exchange markets and in Ireland. So that's kind of the reason to focus on tax, is that we are obviously very interested in constraining public power, but I also think that we're interested in like correcting the geopolitics of where digital wealth is being created and gaining sort of a greater like correction in just like state taxing authority to access a bit of that wealth and pull it, you know, like plug it back into those economies, which kind of gets to your question about antitrust. So yes, we can, and I think antitrust, I think a lot of the pathologies, I won't speak to Canadian antitrust, but I think a lot of the pathologies of US antitrust right now with like not being able to index and like do something about concentrated power in the digital economy has to do with the fact that we have to think about questions like market power and market concentration purely by looking at exchange value, and we're not looking at all of the power that these companies are cultivating as prediction value. So I think antitrust is also a legal regime that stands to gain from thinking through the importance of prediction value in the digital economy, and I think there's room for them to do their thing, all in favor of that, but also think that there's an important role for particularly international tax to play, not just in constraining private power, but also like reallocating wealth, which is like one of the things that tax does.
Hey, you know, I want to jump in here and ask a question, Salomé, about the dynamics of the term conversion that you've been using in your talk. You've been talking about how prediction value is converted into exchange value. And you were telling us, especially at the end, you were saying that if we distinguish use value from exchange value, that will bring into our kind of legal view the way that value cultivation in the digital economy is producing a kind of a gap, right? I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit, this goes back to Luke's question, I think, about inference that doesn't really function or doesn't have the use value that it promises to have. So could you say something a little bit more about the rhetoric through which prediction value is said to need to be converted into exchange value? So prediction value is sort of passing itself off, not as an exchange value, but as somehow connected to use value. And in fact, perhaps that's not true, because perhaps the prediction doesn't have the use that it says it does. So could you say more about distinguishing the prediction value and the use value, and what kinds of political action perhaps are needed to create that distinction, to emphasize that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what makes it tricky is that I think right now a lot of companies just kind of uncritically point to the power of prediction, but they leave very vague, because they're allowed to, exactly how that predictive power kind of like flows through the corporate machinery to spit money out on the other end. So it's kind of like our language is like, let's pay attention to like that thing, you know, like that conversion, that transformation, that transmutation. I think all of those might be at different moments the better way of like transfiguration, thinking of what's going on. And all of them might be, any one of them might be better equipped rhetorically to, again, kind of express that right now, again, because we kind of, as a legal perspective, it's like nothing to see here. Get us once it meets the market, and there's like a market cap for us to worry about. We don't really have to inquire too much about whether or not what we have is like hay getting spun into gold or, gold. So, or leprechauns gold, fool's gold versus gold. And yeah, so, I mean, again, like, I think there's so much work to be done thinking through those claims. And again, I think I've hinted at this in my answer to Luke and a bit in the talk too. I think once we just sort of say like, hey, as a set of legal actors, we're going to pay attention to prediction value. One thing that we can start for hopefully doing a bit better is figuring out what if that is just like pure puffery that's being kind of like, I don't know, I'm pulling all kinds of different literary metaphors together here, but like being spun into like pure speculative value that's like befuddling and fooling market actors. And what if it like does actually have true prediction use value, is like in a sense like has better use value, is more predictive, is of greater predictive value than this other thing that's sort of right now kind of clumped into exactly the same process because like we don't care. And so again, I think that there are probably there's different language attached to those different things. But again, from like a legal perspective, we can't even begin to sort of distinguish between them if we just don't think this is a category of value prediction that matters.
Right.
I don't know if you have a follow-up to that, but yeah.
No, I'm just thinking about the unpriced externalities of this particular speculative system, right? So it's sort of loss of privacy would be one of the unpriced externalities here.
Totally. Yeah.
And
I
guess in the unconscious of spinning hay into gold from the Rumpelstiltskin, wasn't that about promising the unborn child to, right? And so promising something that is to come, that in fact we can't afford to promise.
Right.
Seems to be at the heart of all of this. Okay, so we do have some questions from people who are asking if I will read them. And if there are other questions, please, people, please use the raise hand function. I'm going to read a question from Berna Orak. How do we ensure that the quality of the data used is guaranteed when consequences are drawn prediction value for social areas like health? And I think this kind of goes to the topic that we're on here, right? So how do we, is ensuring that the data has quality going to solve the problem, or will that in fact not even solve the problem? There's another question here.
I think it depends on what you think the problem is. So if you are extremely interested in like an accurate prediction of like whether or not I'm pregnant, then absolutely, I think ensuring that prediction is based on like, first of all, like sound data that like you've derived a population with a set of features that indicate pregnancy. We can peer under the hood and do like data science assessment of whether or not that conclusion is justified from the data that you've collected. And that's like a data quality question. And then you can say like, has that reliably been tied to things like changed TV viewing patterns? Like how strong a connection is that? What are your p-values on that? Like, is that really like a justified inference or, prediction to be making on the basis of how you kind of linked statistical anomalies in changed TV viewing habits with kind of a control population that you both know is pregnant and exhibited the same statistical anomalies in changed TV viewing habits. That's totally a question. So we can solve that problem if we start to do something like impose legal standards and discipline on like, if you're going to claim that you have prediction value, that needs to be statistically supported to some level. The same way that like, we would say like, if you're going to claim that you have like all organic products, we're going to like assess that on a certain standard level. Or if you're going to claim that your asset is like meets this asset class like AAA ranking that like means something regulatorily. So it could solve that problem. It's not going to solve another kind of classic normative problems which we might have, which is like, given that abortion is essentially illegal in half of, well, not half, but like a third of US states right now, should we be datifying to that level of accuracy knowledge about people's pregnancy, absent any regime where they could like meaningfully control whether or not that insight is being applied to them or not? It's not going to solve that problem, but it will solve the former problem. And again, thinking about prediction value, we can start to think about like, okay, is our problem like that the value is being cultivated even like in a true, accurate, predictive way, or is our problem the sort of processes of commodification that sort of drive how it's being used, one effect of which is that it's like often kind of speculative and junky. Again, okay. Yeah.
Fantastic. I see a hand from Alice Wang. Alice?
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I don't know if my question is going to make sense, but I'm interested in the normative question, and I'm wondering what the distinct role that data plays is. So if you think that there's a business that did a really in-depth study of social psychology and then comes up with this fantastic market strategy, there doesn't seem to be the same, well, at least my intuition is that there's nothing really wrong with it. But then when it comes to data, there seems to be this intuition that there is a problem here, or a normative issue here at least. And if the issue is not just in privacy, then I wonder if you have any idea on the normative question. Yeah, what is specific to data in the context? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that I think about a lot. Again, and this is just me, I tend to think that the role that data play, what is distinct about data is not necessarily the kind of normative or even legal problems. It doesn't raise to me like new classes of normative problem or legal problem. It might raise in a new way or a new form a class of legal issue or a class of normative problem that we already have. So by which I mean like, what's specific to data to me is that it materializes a form of insight that allows it to kind of like have an ongoing life. So now like the fact that I bought coffee at 9:30 at this store, which is like a thing that another person could like know about me before in like an inchoate way, is now materialized. And that grants it a set of affordances. It can be connected to a lot of other information about a lot of other data about all the other purchases that I've ever made that allows someone to develop a really rich picture of me that might feel quite powerful and violative. I think that gets to the privacy interest, but it can also now like sort of live on as a materialized form of insight that can get collected with like and combined with like all other coffee users at that store, all other coffee users in the world, everybody who's buying coffee at 9:30, which can be used to sort of derive insights about people who are like me, people who are quite different from me. What is it? Who are people who are buying coffee at 9 o'clock? That can get used for any number of reasons, for any number of purposes. And that's kind of like it's a power. It's a form of power. It's like a form of capacity. Now, we might have normative issues with that are distinct. Like I said, you know, I think that we have privacy interests in that. Like that's one set of normative interests. But once you have that kind of materialized insight, that you then get operationalized to enact social processes, I think a distinct class of normative interests or concerns that we might have, again, let's take the pregnancy example. I think it's more visceral for this point, is like, you could violate my privacy by knowing I'm pregnant. You can also collect a lot of information about pregnancy and then operationalize the social fact of pregnancy status in a subordinating way, right? Which is like the abortion legal enforcement example. And I think what makes that normatively wrong isn't that like you collected information about me without my consent. What makes that normatively wrong is that you're like doing sex subordination on me and a whole class of other people. And that's like, sex subordination is like normatively a problem, right? And so data is materializing processes by which sex subordination happens. Sex subordination is not a new normative problem, but it's being materialized by, like data systems in new ways, if that is like potentially an answer. So that's how I kind of think about the difference, is that there's like a capacity or like a power, like an affordance now, that gives like a tangibility or a materiality to like social facts that we've long known, like people are like one another, right? The same way that like long before we had electrical lines, people knew that like electricity was a form of power, but now we've materialized it and we can act on it and we can store it and we can operationalize it. And like that, I think there's like a materiality distinction to data, not to me like a normative distinction. It's a long answer, rambling, but hopefully responsive.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to read a question from the chat, since I'm not seeing hands raised, but I do see questions in the chat. So this is from Angela Xiao Wu. Thanks so much for this fabulous talk. Could you elaborate to what extent the gap between what you call prediction value and exchange value is what Shoshana Zuboff calls behavioral surplus? And there, Angela's also mentioning scripts of a typology of how that surplus is generated. So sort of your thoughts on Zuboff's work, and the end of the question is, when it comes to legal relevance, is there some critical change happening, being left outside of the inquiry when social data is the focus of analysis?
Yeah, I think in the piece we even say this in part one. So what we call prediction value, a bunch of people have called a bunch of things. I would say probably we're touching on very similar things to what Zuboff, like as a phenomenon or as like an entity, what Zuboff calls behavioral surplus is probably what we would call exchange value. There might be some distinctions like on the edges. I don't know if all prediction value is like surplus. I need to think about that. But in rough sketches, I would say yes. Where I think I tend to maybe distinguish is that our definition of social data, I think, captures a broader set of phenomena than Zuboff, I think, tracks in her definition of behavioral surplus, which would really only get at like our first category, like data directly derived from people, as opposed to, like I said, like you could analyze weather and use that to predict traffic patterns. I'm not sure that that would fall within the class of behavioral data or behavioral surplus that Zuboff is tracking in her definition. But it's been like a while since I've read that book carefully, so I could be wrong about that. So that's potentially one point of distinction. I think another point of distinction is that Shoshana Zuboff strikes me as somebody who's extremely concerned with the kind of like epistemic and like knowledge formation effects that privatizing access to our individual selves has, which is this like, I am no longer the captain of my own self-identity and self-formation point, which is like a valid normative critique. I don't think we're as focused on that in our evaluation and in our process, in our work. There's sort of like a pure descriptive interest that we have in this piece in just like understanding prediction value, which is quite separate from like, I think for her, the descriptive analysis of behavioral surplus contains within it kind of like a normative judgment of behavioral surplus, which is that it is bad. And I think we're more willing to sort of suspend judgment on the entire category of prediction value, as my like positive use case showed. Like, I actually think there are ways that data can materialize and enact on pregnancy status that are good. I don't know if it totally resides within Zubov's analysis to say, like, you can extract behavioral surplus by like invading the inner dark continent of people's lives and then like use it for good. Like, I don't read her as like having that kind of like normative agnosticism in her diagnosis. So that's maybe like another point of distinction. When it comes to legal relevance, is there critical changes happening that's being left outside of the inquiry when social data is the focus of analysis? I don't know. I mean, I think that some people might argue that we and have that focusing on social data might like diminish the individual interests that we have in processes of datafication. So it might diminish or put to one side like that I do have very strong individual stakes in information about my pregnancy being datafied. I guess I would push back on that characterization. I don't think, as I said, like we can have many legal interests in the same phenomenon. So I can have privacy interests in the datafication of the fact of my pregnancy that don't totally index or reduce or even necessarily diminish the social or political interests in the datafication of pregnancy. Now, those interests might clash with one another, and then we would have to think about like in which instance they take precedent. That's like what law is in the business of doing all the time. But I don't know. But if you're like very critically interested in like the preservation of those privacy interests as like legal interests, not necessarily as like political economic phenomenon, then you might think that the mere existence of the category of social data as opposed to personal data presents a bit of a like threat. Again, I would disagree with that view, but like I think one could fairly reasonably have that view.
So there's a comment. It's specified as a comment, not a question. This is from Anne Charles. And Anne is mentioning use value from Adam Smith. We could insert Marx as well, that use value differs from exchange value and therefore market price. And so as a comment, I'm thinking this is a comment asking to say more about non-conversion value is what's listed here, or conversion value. And I think also just I would add in like is part of the problem that prediction value is an exchange value being passed off as a use value, and that's sort of it's saying, oh, this is going to have a use value, but really it's just a speculative exchange value.
Exchange value. Yeah. Great question. Yeah. So if you read the piece, we kind of get into the whole history of use value, or not the whole history, but we like evoke the whole history of use value being like a very old concept in economic thought. Actually prefigures Adam Smith and Marx. I think I'll have to pull up, I'm going to pull up quickly this piece because I'm forgetting which. Aristotle talks about the value of using a sandal as a sandal as opposed to selling a sandal on the market. That Aristotle quote is actually quoted in Marx's discussion of use versus exchange value. And I think it's St. Augustine who talks about natural value and how it's like messed up on the market that like a mouse, which is like a higher order of being, has like no value on the market as opposed to like grain, which is like a lower order being. So there's a very old tradition of thinking about natural or use value as like conceptually distinct from something's market value. And we are drawing on that history. Now, where we kind of depart from classical political economy is that we're not interested in sort of like defending or like resurfacing or sort of articulating a systematic formalized relationship between use and exchange value. We're merely saying like, okay, like let's recognize that these are conceptually distinct forms that value can take. Let's posit that the particular form of use value that social data has in the digital economy is prediction value used to derive predictions from people. And then we can start to think about how companies do or do not transfigure, convert, transform prediction value into exchange value. I think, Avery, to your point, one could say that like one pathology of not paying attention to that transformation is that there might be forms of social data that actually are of very low use value, but of high exchange value. And we're currently like shoving that into, or is being sold under the banner of having high prediction value, but it doesn't, right? So yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, there's a hand from Sarah Sharia. Sarah? I think, let's see. Sarah, are you there?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Great.
So first of all, I wanted to say thank you so much for this great talk. And I wanted to ask a question regarding social data. And what would the pros and cons be? Like, to what extent could the other party take it by consuming data from us to make capital interest? And will this ever get out of control?
I mean, I think in some sense it has already. You know, if you back my sort of like initial chart, just like how much data is being generated right now, like again, 25 gigabytes per hour just from us driving. That is the reason that it, like, companies pay to put expensive sensors in cars and pay for data centers to store that data and cool that data and pay the salaries of data scientists to like make sense of that data, is because they're interested in like taking a lot of information about people living their life and like turning it into money. So there is like, I think what we're very interested in this piece is like we would say like growing evidence of there being like hegemonic market pressure for companies to datafy in order to stay competitive. That's what it means to live under informational capitalism. So you have to informationalize to stay credit. That's like market pressure, hegemonic market pressure that companies face. And from that flows real incentives to, as you say, like take social data from us, to data for, you know, I don't know if it's taking, it's like materializing a lot of facts about our life in a particular way to extract and exploit value. Now, I think what we're interested in pointing out is that at a general level, again, the basic insight that like humans are socially constituted and like facts about people like me might meaningfully have something to say about me. That's just kind of operationalizing sociality. And what we're not interested in is saying like, do a Margaret Thatcher, like there is no society in the digital world, like retreat, like you have to treat me like an individual, like that can't be right. Like we are social beings, we're socially constituted. And so much of what it means for like me to live an empowered life is for like people like me to live empowered lives. So much of what it means for like me to live in like a relationship of mutual recognition and respect with Avery is like materialized in analog life, like in the various ways that we see one another and recognize one another as political equals. And like, insofar as data relations are materializing the fact of our sociality, the pros would be like ways of materializing just in digital form, the analog ways in which sociality is like a thing that can make us lift one another up and recognize one another as equals and operationalize and enact equal political and social and economic relations. So that's kind of like at a high level, the pros. What that means for us as like legal scholars is thinking about like, when we allow the political economy, that like hegemonic market pressure to determine in what way our lives are datafied, certain features about us get really emphasized, like my commercial activity, like my capacity to buy shoes. Like we know a lot about my shoe purchasing preferences. We probably don't know enough about like my CO2 emissions. But that seems like something really important. And so from like a legal architectural design perspective, what I don't want to do is overdiagnose datafying facts about me as inherently bad. When in fact, what I might say is like, we're probably over datafying commercially valuable facts about me, but under datafying potentially very socially important things about me, but that aren't necessarily so easily commercially operationalized, like my CO2 emission status. It seems like an important thing to know in a world heading into climate change. And so that's kind of the distinction that we're interested in drawing when we kind of withhold normative diagnosis from prediction value.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Salomé, for this amazing conversation. I think we've all really enjoyed having a chance to think such a theoretical level and hearing from you about the political and legal economy of social data, such an important topic. So thank you so much. Thanks to the audience for participating and for attending. And just want to make the announcement that our next SRI seminar will be next Wednesday, same time. We hope to see you back October 11th. We're featuring Marzia Fadai from the Cohere for AI. She's a senior research scientist at Cohere for AI. And her talk is Mastering Language Understanding with AI, How Multilingualism Shapes LLMs. So it'll be an interesting talk. And if you would like to continue to be part of SRI events, we have an upcoming event at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy on Friday, October 20th. We'll be featuring Wendy Wong in conversation with Anna Sue, celebrating the launch of Wendy Wong's new book, We the Data, published by MIT Press. And SRI just published an interview with Wendy on our SRI site today. It's a great read, and it speaks to many of the important themes of data's social impacts that Salomé raised in her talk today. So post a link to register for both our seminar and Wendy's book launch in the chat for this Zoom talk. And we look forward to seeing many of you next time. And let's give a round of applause to Salomé Viljoen. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you. I really enjoyed the conversation and the questions. They were really fantastic. So thanks again.